After leaving the Garden of Gethsemane, the soldiers and the scribes and the priests and the angry crowd brought Jesus to the temple, and they brought him before the high priest Caiaphas. As a common criminal he stood there, and not one of his disciples was around to defend him. But there were others, people who had been paid to come forward and tell lies about Jesus, about things they had seen him do and things they had heard him say. Everything was a lie because everything they said was bad. And the crowd that stood around outside, all those people who had shouted, "Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," they were out there getting angry. They believed those liars. And the high priest kept questioning Jesus and asking him things, and Jesus never said a word. At last the high priest was very angry, and he said, "People tell me that you claim to be the Son of God. Is that true?" And Jesus looked at that high priest and he said, "I am the Christ, the Son of the living God." Oh my, was the high priest angry. He said, "Take this man away and beat him and whip him well, and then bring him back to me for sentencing." And so the soldiers dragged Jesus away. They whipped him, they beat him, they tied a blindfold around his eyes, and they spit on him. And they said, "If you're the Christ, tell us who's spitting on you. Which one of us just did that?" And they'd spit again. At last, when they had beaten him and whipped him enough, they brought him back to the high priest, bruised, aching, hurting. And the high priest said, "Take him away to the governor. Let him decide what shall be done." While all this was going on, out in the temple courtyard, Judas returned, and he asked to talk to one of the priests. He said, "I have sinned. I have sinned. I have given you an innocent man. Take your money back. Give me that man. Let him go. He's innocent." And the priest looked at him and he said, "I don't think so. We don't want your money." Judas said, "Take it and release Jesus." But they would not take it. So Judas threw the bag of money on the floor and he ran out of the temple. And instead of asking Jesus to forgive him, he ran away and he hanged himself. And that was a very terrible thing to do. While all these events were happening inside the temple, people stood out in the courtyard, milling about, talking and wondering what was going to happen. You remember it was very, very early in the morning, probably still dark outside, and they had been there because everybody had heard the news that Jesus was captured, and some people were thinking about all the good things he had done, and others were saying bad things about him. And Peter, the only one of the disciples with a little bit of courage, came back very quietly, and he stood back behind all the people, and he listened to what they had to say, and he could not believe that this was happening to his Jesus. And suddenly, a young woman who had been watching Peter said to him, "Weren't you with that man, that Jesus, also? Weren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter said, "No, that must have been somebody else. I think you've got me confused." And so the young woman didn't say any more, and other people just kind of went on with their discussion. But very shortly thereafter, another young woman stepped forward. And she said to Peter, "I'm sure I saw you with Jesus. She's right, you know. I'm positive you are one of his disciples." Well, Peter was getting very frightened and very angry, and he did something bad. He started to swear and to use bad language. And he said, "You don't know what you're talking about. I do not know this man. Leave me alone." Well, neither of the women said too much of anything after that. But then, in a few minutes, A man came up behind him and he said, "I recognize you, sir. I can tell by the way you talk that you come from Galilee." And Jesus came from Galilee too. "You are one of his disciples, aren't you?" Well, Peter was so terrified by this time, afraid that maybe they were going to take him and do the same thing to him that they had just done to Jesus, that he started screaming and shouting and swearing. And he said to the men, "You don't know what you're talking about. I am not one of his disciples. I don't know the man." Well, as Peter said those words, a guard brought Jesus back into the temple. The words were just barely out of Peter's mouth, and the rooster crowed. And Jesus just looked at Peter. He never said a word. And Peter remembered that Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter's heart broke. And he turned around and he ran from the temple. And he cried and cried and cried. Jesus was flogged and beaten and whipped and spit upon. His favorite disciple, one of his favorite disciples, Peter, had denied him, and Jesus knew that. Everyone had deserted him. All the people who had come to listen to him, people who had had someone in their family healed by him, maybe somebody who had been raised from the dead. All these people stood around. And in among those people, there were those who grumbled and growled and continued to say evil things about Jesus, evil things that were not true. And the governor said to him, "Do you not hear what the people are saying about you?" And Jesus didn't answer. So Pilate looked at him and he said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "It is as you say." But the people shouted louder and louder, "Crucify him!" At that time, just at that moment, a messenger came, and he stood before Pilate, and he said, "Sir, your wife has said, have nothing to do with this man. She has had a dream, terrible dreams, because of Jesus. He is an innocent man. Have nothing to do with him." Well, that left Pilate in a terrible state. What should he do? So he said, "It is Passover, and it is my custom at Passover to release a prisoner to you. I will release Jesus." And the people said, "No, we don't want Jesus. Crucify him." The Pilate said, "Well," he tried one more time. He said, "There is a prisoner. He is a murderer. His name is Barabbas. I can release Jesus instead of Barabbas." And the people shouted louder, "No, give us Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. Crucify him." And so Pilate stood up, he took a bowl of water and he washed his hands in front of the people and he said, "I wash my hands of this man. Let his blood be upon you." And the people shouted, "His blood is upon us and our children." Pilate said to the soldiers, "Take him away, whip him, and crucify him."